You are listening to Contraband.
Good morning, and welcome to another episode of the Wake Up Call. If you haven't heard, on Tuesday, Claudette Colvin, a pioneer of the civil rights movement, became an ancestor. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because I think a lot of people think they know about Claudette Colvin, and some of the stuff that you think you know is not true at all. You know, when anybody talks about the Montgomery bus boycott or Rosa Parks, someone always says, well, Claudette Colvin was first. Not really. See, when Claudette was 2 years old, there was a woman named Viola White who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. Viola said, nah, I'm just not going to accept these charges. She was arrested, convicted. She was fined $10, but when she tried to appeal, so she went to E.D. Nixon, who was this NAACP leader. He was a Pullman porter. He was like the man in Birmingham. And E.D. said, hey, we're going to help you fight this case, but first, we got to find you a lawyer. And while they were looking and while the case was pending in circuit court, a police officer kidnapped Viola White's daughter, took her to a graveyard, sexually assaulted her, and left her for dead. Mysteriously, her case disappeared. Back to Claudette Colvin. So first of all, Claudette Colvin's name is not really Claudette Colvin. She was born Claudette Austin. And when she was a young girl, she and her sister Delphine moved in with their aunt and uncle, Marianne and QP. And they were living in Pine Level, Alabama, this little small town in Alabama. They went to school in a one-room schoolhouse, and Marianne and QP could see, all of Claudette's teachers could see that Claudette was academically gifted. So when she was 8 years old, they said, man, we got to get Claudette out of this one-room schoolhouse. Luckily, one of their relatives said, hey, we're moving, and we have this house in Montgomery, and you can just come there and live in it. So when Claudette was 8 years old, her, Delphine, Marianne, QP, packed up everything, put it on the back of a wagon pulled by a horse, and moved to Montgomery, Alabama. Now, they didn't know a lot of people. Luckily, they had one woman who was from their hometown that they knew. She knew Claudette's parents. She knew Marianne and QP. She was originally from Pine Level, but she had moved to Montgomery because the Klan was bad in Pine Level, and her name was Rosa Parks. And so Claudette moves to Montgomery. She and Delphine didn't have a lot of friends, but, you know, they had each other. And when they started going to school in Montgomery, the teachers in Montgomery realized, like, hey, this girl is really smart, so we're going to bump her up a grade. So by the time she was 13 years old, it was time for her to go to high school. And that summer, two things happened. One, Claudette's sister, Delphine, died of polio. The second thing that happened was there was one guy in that neighborhood who treated Claudette really nice. And his name was Jeremiah Reeves. You know, he was like really popular. Everybody used to kid Claudette that, like, that's going to be your boyfriend. Jeremiah going to be your boyfriend. And when Jeremiah was 16 years old, he was accused of sneaking into a woman's house that he had been having an affair with as a grocery delivery and raping her. And Jeremiah was arrested and given the death penalty. 16-year-old kid. And Jeremiah Reeves was this huge instigating force in Montgomery civil rights before the bus boycott. And he was Claudette's friend. That's what got her involved in the civil rights movement before white people started calling it the civil rights movement. Because again, Black people didn't start asking for their rights in 1955. So Claudette was already what you would call now woke. Claudette Colvin is attending Booker T. Washington High School. She's a little bit younger than the rest of her friends, but because of Jeremiah, she's active in what we call the civil rights movement now. And she writes this paper, and she got a B on it. And Claudette Colvin was mad. Like, she knew her paper was good. So She and her friend got on the bus that day coming home from school, and she's talking about, man, I knew I shouldn't have got a B on that paper. And there's a few things you have to understand. People think that like there was a black section and there was a white section. That's not really how the buses work. What there was a sign, and the sign would designate which part of the bus was for black people to sit down and which part of the bus was for white people to sit down. So if you were black, you had to pay your fare, get off the bus, go to the back of the bus, enter through the back door, and sit down behind that sign. By law, there was supposed to be a black section and a white section. But if there was too many white people on the bus, like all the black people had to stand up. So in a sense, like the white people owned all of the seats. And so Claudette got on the bus and she sat in the black section. The bus driver, after a couple of stops, saw a white woman get on and stand up. He told Claudette Colvin and her friend, hey, just move back. And the friend moved back, and another lady, a black lady, sat next to Claudette. And the bus driver told her to move back. And the black lady moved back. Now, here's the second thing you have to understand about the buses in Montgomery and all across the country. Although there was a designated black section, there was also a tradition that was from nothing but white supremacy that said white people don't sit on the row with black people, even if they weren't in the same two seats, like across the aisle. They wouldn't sit on the same row. That was demeaning to white people. They didn't sit on the same level with black people, and they didn't sit behind black people. So the woman wanted Claudette Colvin to move, not to have a seat, because there was an open seat, but so she wouldn't have to sit next to a black woman. And Claudette Colvin refused. And she refused, she said, because she thought about her friend Jeremiah. She thought about her sister. She said she could hear the ancestors whispering in her ear. And she refused to move. And she was arrested. And when her case came, E.D. Nixon says, hey, well, I know a lawyer now. And he went and hired Fred Gray. So a few days later, a woman named Miss Susie refused to give up her seat. There were other women who refused to give up their seat. So when Fred Gray filed the case against Mayor W.A. Gale, the mayor of Montgomery, he filed it on behalf of Aurelia Browder, who sat on that bus after Claudette Colvin. He filed it on behalf of Claudette Colvin. And he filed it on behalf of everyone except Rosa Parks, because Rosa Parks had not sat down yet, right? Rosa Parks wouldn't do it until December 5th. Claudette Colvin was a plaintiff, Aurelia Browder, Miss Susie, all of those people who did it before Rosa Parks were a part of that case. So although Claudette didn't do it first, because again, many people had stood up for their rights and asserted their humanity on Montgomery buses. She was the first of the plaintiffs in the case Browder versus Gale that ended up desegregating buses. So she was the first plaintiff in that case to refuse to move, but she wasn't the first in Montgomery. She wasn't the first on a Montgomery bus. She wasn't the first, definitely the first in the nation. We've written about that on Contraband Camp already. There's another thing. I know you've heard, like, Claudette Colvin wasn't chosen to be highlighted because of her being pregnant. When that happened, no one knew she was pregnant. They say it was because she was dark-skinned. It was because she was too young. But what really happened is when Rosa Parks sat down on that seat and when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, she was working as a seamstress. She was working as a seamstress for a guy who was a lawyer, and he was a civil rights lawyer. He had just moved to Montgomery. Him and his wife was actively involved in the civil rights movement. It was a white guy. And he had paid for Rosa Parks to attend the Highlander Training School, which was basically like a summer academy for activists. He had already been like investigated by Congress for supporting the Highlander Training School. It's actually where the song We Shall Overcome came from. The white people at the Highlander Training School actually stole it, but that's from some black women in South Carolina. But that's a whole other story. So Rosa Parks went to the Highlander Training School specifically to be trained in activism. Rosa Parks was recruited by E.D. Nixon to be the secretary of the NAACP. She was sent to the Highlander Training School to learn how to be an activist. And that's why she was chosen, right? It was because she had been prepared. It wasn't just that Claudette Colvin was pregnant or because she was dark-skinned or because she was young. That may have played a part, but you also have to realize that there were a bunch of other women. Aurelia Browder, who was a college student and was 27 years old. There was Joanne Gibson Robinson, who was the person who typed up the idea that we're going to boycott these buses. There was Miss Susie, who was an elderly woman who had been living in Montgomery all of her life. There were a lot of people to choose from. It wasn't just a choice between Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks, right? The people who were part of that case were not pregnant. They were not all dark-skinned. Miss Susie passed for white. They could have easily chosen her, right? They want to make it seem like black people have these prejudices and like black people do these spontaneous ideas, and not that the civil rights movement was a well thought out strategic plan. When Claudette Colvin actually took her stand, Rosa Parks was out of town at the Highlander Training School. So she got that training and came back. And she was also in charge of the youth division of the NAACP, of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP. She was really the only person that Jeremiah Reeves was talking to when he sat on death row. So when she came back from the Highlander Training School and they told her about Claudette Colvin came to Rosa Parks' meeting for the youth council of the NAACP, and that's where they met. But Rosa Parks knew, like her aunt and uncle, and started mentoring Claudette Colvin because she thought like, oh, I'm going to train this girl to be the face of this movement. And between that time, when she was mentoring and spending the night at Rosa Parks' house, and when Rosa Parks took her stand, Claudette Colvin got pregnant and people found out she was pregnant. But it wasn't like she was denied the right. She didn't become the face of the movement because she was pregnant or dark-skinned or too young. They had actually chosen her. Rosa Parks was mentoring her to be the face. Fred Gray was working on the case with Claudette Colvin, not Rosa Parks, right? And the importance of this is that Claudette Colvin is actually the person who ended segregation on Montgomery buses. That case, not the boycott, not Rosa Parks sitting down, because again, Rosa Parks wasn't part of the case. It was filed before Rosa Parks took her stand. So we can honor Rosa Parks' stand because it led to one of the first collective protests of what they call the civil rights movement. But it was Claudette Colvin who actually ended segregation on Montgomery bus. But she wasn't the first. She was the first in that case. And the reason it's important to know this history, we sometimes are taught that, it takes a person with no blemishes, a perfect person to start a movement or to be the face of a movement when they were actually going to make Claudette Colvin the face of that movement. It also, we also sometimes think that like it takes this big, huge collective effort by the NAACP and all the people in town and some money and some lawyers. When Claudette Colvin took a stand because she knew it was right. And it just takes one person. And if you believe that you should wait for a meeting or a lawyer or a collective movement to do what's right, then it'll never happen. That's the legacy of Claudette Colvin. As a matter of fact, Claudette Colvin said, what I did was a spark and it caught on. I'm not disappointed. Let the people know Rosa Parks was the right person for the boycott, but also let them know that the attorneys took 4 other women to the Supreme Court to challenge the law that led to the end of segregation. And that's Claudette Colvin's legacy. She took a stand for what was right with no training, she took a stand for what was right by herself. She didn't have the training. She didn't have a movement behind her. She did what was right because it was right. And what she did changed the world.
You are listening to Contraband.